Joining us today. As Michelle said, my name's Matt Fedorko, and I'm from Blue Strike Environmental. And I'm excited to take you guys through what we envision as kind of a waste sorting 101 conversation for events. At Blue Strike Environmental, we specialize in driving sustainability within sports and large-scale events to try and help clients ultimately achieve a positive environmental impact. Our team focus on creating customized and specialized programs to help people reduce their waste and carbon while ultimately making these sustainable practices achievable and tangible, as well as effective. And by focusing on education and our community engagement within the waste sorting conversation, it gives us the ability to empower stakeholders to kind of embrace not only their internal sustainability, but the sustainability programming that might be happening at the event that you're involved in or the organization that you're involved in, both locally and globally. And with that, waste sorting really does play a critical role in creating kind of a sustainable, impactful experience for people at an event. So today we're going to explore what I envision a bit of the basics to waste sorting and its importance for sustainability. This presentation, as Michelle said, is somewhat of a high-level conversation. It's got a sprinkle of detail and in-depth examples throughout the conversation, but the goal of this is to get through it, to be able to have kind of a meaningful discussion back and forth at the end, to engage you guys with questions and chat about anything that we'd like to discuss or that would be asked. So continuing into what is waste sorting. When people hear waste sorting, it can mean a lot of things. A lot of things can come to people's minds. But in my opinion, waste sorting is kind of the foundational step for responsible waste disposal at your events. And it's where, as an event organizer or operator, you can actually see the tangible impacts of the programming that you're ultimately putting in place. At its core, sorting involves separating the waste material into the different categories: recyclable, compostable, and landfill waste. This separation helps us from a general conversation be able to discuss about what can be processed in the most environmentally friendly ways possible. And I also want to acknowledge that these aren't the only three categories, right? You've got materials donations, you have food donations, you have other nuanced recyclable avenues and conversations that can be had that all feed into this program. But from the lens of today in waste sorting, we are speaking in terms of waste recycling and composting. That being said, each event kind of requires its own unique sorting approach. What works for maybe a small 500-person community gathering event will absolutely not work for a large-scale sporting event at a football stadium. And it's just because it becomes much more nuanced. There's a lot of different variables and factors that are involved, as well as just the amount of waste and the type of waste generated. For instance, at a large-scale event, you might need hundreds of waste stations in 3 separate sorting locations because of how people have to move the waste throughout the facility or the venue. And maybe at a smaller event, you can have the sorting station right next to your dumpsters so that the people that are stewarding the waste throughout the event can bring it back to them. They can manage it, sort it right there real time, and then toss it in the dumpster and have no issue. But the real value in waste sorting kind of lies in what I mentioned earlier, the measurable impact that we can have by it, the ability to see the raw data of the efforts that were put in.
Okay.
By sorting properly, we can improve diversion rates throughout the events, which ultimately obviously means we're keeping more items out of the landfill, which significantly reduces your environmental footprint from a physical standpoint, and all ultimately helps us kind of achieve the ultimate goal that we're pursuing. And with those baselining metrics, it gives you the ability to respond to the numbers and see, okay, well, we were hoping to achieve this, but in actuality, this is what happened. And it is because of these following vendors. Another advantage of waste sorting is you're touching all of the waste, or somebody is touching all of the waste. So it gives you an eye into what your vendors are bringing to the event, what attendees are bringing into the event, what your most consistent trash item is that you know right off the top of your head has a recyclable or a compostable alternative that would be a no-brainer addition into the next year's programming. But that kind of stems into the importance of waste sorting itself. And I am trying to go to the next page. There we go. My apologies. The importance of waste sorting. So I want to discuss sorting as an essential kind of component for these events that need to happen. First, waste sorting has an immense environmental benefit. Obviously, we are reducing the amount of waste that we are sending to the landfill, but that also has a greenhouse gas emission impact by pulling those items out of the landfill and a reduction of methane and potent other gases. Proper sorting also helps us conserve resources by sending recyclables back into the production line. Now, there's a lot of nuanced conversations about recycling and what ultimately gets back into the line, but the only way to get it back into the line is to have a program in place and make an effort to try and get it into the production line again. Second, effective waste sorting is a vital component for events to really achieve their sustainable goals. Whether it's a zero waste certification that is mandated within your county, within your state, whether it's a title sponsor's expectation that is ultimately being handed off to you all to make sure that you adhere to the title sponsor's sustainability practices. There are certifications and things that are going to be in place throughout the life of your event that you can ultimately pursue. And these certifications almost always have a component that are involving resource management and the waste control. The certifications are becoming a lot more common, and they demonstrate ultimately an event's commitment and ability and willingness to minimize their environmental impact. Waste sorting is it's tangible, it's trackable, and it gives you the ability to measure against and improve upon. And then finally, waste sorting responsibly enhances an event's image, whatever the event is, or the sorting sponsor, or the program in general around the sustainability initiative. It is a brand enhancer. Today, attendees are really increasing their eco-conscious and values that they have at events, whether it's in a personal life or a work life. This expectation is kind of being bestowed upon a lot more of their regular engagements with events and things. And so by committing to sustainability practices like waste sorting at an event, you can not only reduce your impact, but you can resonate with a lot of the audiences and the people that are ultimately coming out to your event, which naturally builds a stronger brand recognition for yourself and the attendees at the event. And with the explanation of, in my opinion, the importance of kind of what waste sorting is, I did want to touch on these two quick graphics real quick. Hopefully you guys can see this when I click on it. But this is an example for you all of a music festival that we were engaged with in Monterey, I shouldn't say we're still engaged with, the Cali Roots Festival in Monterey, California. So we got brought into the event in 2017 as a baseline year. So we went to the event and we just did a waste audit. We got to see how all of the waste functioned, how all of the waste moved throughout the event. And then we engaged with all of the haulers and processors and put together a diversion number to try and figure out, okay, with outside of just putting recycling receptacles out and hoping that your attendees are doing the right thing, where does the event sit in terms of in terms of waste diversion? And that is reflected here at about 40%, which typically is what we see in an event space. If you're not actively making an effort to reduce or sort the impact that you're generating, as long as you have waste and recycling receptacles out and you have a relationship with a hauler or a processor that can process the materials correctly, we typically see 30 to 40 or so percent from kind of that level of impact. And that really varies, but this is a great example to baseline. Going into 2018, we put together a program, a waste sorting program, based on everything that we saw at the music festival. We identified the stakeholders that were bringing in problem items. We engaged with them and made recommendations. We engaged with the event, and we even had an audit in place to where a day before the event, we would go by all of the vendors at the event itself and check all of the materials that they brought, and then dock anybody that didn't bring anything that aligned with the sustainability programming, because it was ultimately contributing to the waste that was being sent to the landfill. And so you can see kind of what that impact has. So we went from 40% to 81% in 2018. We learned a lot, and we have been trending and staying really between 80 and 85% over the last handful of years. But this is an example of what kind of impact you can have from a baseline year and knowledge gathering, regardless of the size of your event, to correctly scaling and planning for the amount of waste that's being generated and make sure that it's being sorted. And like I said, this is, I would say, medium scale music festival. They have 10 or so thousand attendees on their Saturday at the biggest point at their main stage. But over the weekend, they bring roughly 25-30,000 people out to the event. And then a large scale example, I will touch on this briefly as well. but this is the college football playoffs program that our team orchestrated and oversaw in 2023. So I was at SoFi Stadium in 2023 during the Georgia football game with 50 people sitting down in their dumpster room, and all of the trash that was being generated from the stadium was coming down to us in troves, and we were, as fast as humanly possible, sorting through all of that waste. What that ultimately looked like is 7 days of 2 shifts staffed at 50 people per shift. And we went through 82 tons of waste over the 7 days, and were able to achieve an 89% waste diversion of those 82 tons that we went through. Now, in here, it does say 127 tons. That is collectively across the entire program. But the program that we were involved in was at SoFi Stadium. So it's just here to show you that regardless of the scale, it's all the same practices, it's all the same programming. It just scales based on the number of people that are needed and the amount of time and effort really that has to go into the planning for the event. But then we continue on to, oh, we're zoomed in a little, overcoming the implementation hurdles of waste sorting. So waste sorting sounds fun and dandy, but it's not something that can just get thrown into place at an event. You typically don't say, I want to sort waste, and then you do nothing before the event, and then you get some volunteers and you sort the waste. That's just not really how it should go. And if it is how it's going, then hopefully through this presentation, you guys can kind of realign the way that you approach this. But as I said, it has its challenges, and we need to be prepared for these. The first major hurdle is just the logistics. Implementing an effective sorting program requires planning. It requires infrastructure or discussions early on. It requires discussions with your local haulers to understand what materials are accepted at their processing facilities, just so that in your sorting experience, you're not contaminating a stream by sorting something into it incorrectly. This also can guide procurement conversations and purchasing conversations when you're engaging with event stakeholders or vendors. And maybe typically commercially you can recycle plastics 1, 2, and 5, but for some reason where your event's located, they actually can't recycle plastics number 2, which is your milk jugs or your harder plastics. Those are inevitably going to be in your waste stream, and if you didn't know that and you set your recycling off thinking, I sent a bunch of plastics off, and your recycling facility sees, well, there's a bunch of milk jugs or juice jugs in here, we're going to have to landfill your whole stream. Without that knowledge, you would have had no clue that that was going to be happening. And it's really, knowledge is power in this instance, because it can help you make so many different decisions earlier on than you typically would be able to. And then additionally, this is training staff. Training staff is absolutely crucial. So staff must meet. My apologies. I keep getting a pop-up. I'm not sure if you guys can see this pop-up. Great. I'm glad you guys can't. I'm going to try and get through it, and it's gone. Okay. But training staff is crucial. So we know, or I'm sure as the people on this call know, that the concept of waste sorting is simple in theory, but in practice it is quite daunting. And so you're not just training the people that you have that are standing there sorting the waste. You're training the people that are stewarding the waste. You're training the vendors to try and help them kind of pre-sort before stuff gets to you, because the other advantage that you, I shouldn't say advantage, a disadvantage that you have is within your waste stream, there's multiple hands that go from the generation of the waste to it ultimately getting to you. And you have to make sure that all of those people are making the right decisions along the way to ultimately alleviate the amount of work that has to be done on the end sorting program. And if all of those steps are taken, then your sorting lift is substantially reduced, because you have people supporting you along the way as the waste is making its way down the stream to you. Secondly, budget allocation. I think this is a really common barrier for people when we're talking about waste sorting, but it's, how can I afford to put a program like this? I mean, sustainable practices often come with an upfront cost like this, and it's naturally a barrier, especially with small to medium scale events, that even large scale events that might have a limited budget. But I would say that it's important to recognize the long-term benefits of the investment, and also that it is not something that you have to try and take on all at once. I am a very big fan and very big proponent of putting together small pilot programs to see where you actually need the help, because additionally, when it comes to sorting, you might think you know what materials you need to sort. You might think you know where you need to put a program in place and where it makes sense for all of the waste to flow. But in practice, that might not make the most sense. And so if instead of taking off the biggest bite you can to try and take the biggest chunk out of your waste diversion, level set with yourself and acknowledge that, you know what, we're on this path and it's all ultimately going towards that goal. And if we haven't taken the step, taking a step regardless of how big it is extremely important, because it starts the conversations within the ecosystem of your event and the people within that event space. And then that naturally feeds into that stakeholder engagement. In order to succeed at these events, you waste sorting has to be a collaborative effort. It is absolutely not just someone like me bringing in 10 of my staff members on site with no communications with anyone before the event and just expecting to be able to achieve 80, 90, 100% waste diversion. It's just, that's not realistic, and it's not feasible. And so making sure that everybody that's involved, all of those other hands that I mentioned previously that touch the waste even before it even gets to the event. It's a topic around suppliers. They have a huge impact on the decisions they make before it gets to you. And that is 5, 6, sometimes a year in advance of your event. Um, which is going to kind of continue to be the song of a lot of this presentation, is just the engagement and the conversations that need to be had with all of the parties involved. But now we get into the actual executional challenges. So this is all just leading into the program. What are the conversations and what are the thoughts and the lenses that we need to have on to approach this programming and this planning? But even with that planning in place, executing the program will present its own challenges. First, and I think foremost that most people can relate to, is contamination control. Your streams, whether you like to think they're clean or not, I promise you, if you don't have a waste sorting team in place, your recycling stream is not 100% recyclable materials. It's probably closer to 70 or 80%. And depending on where you are, that could mean that dumpster is being landfilled because your local processors don't have a debagger at their facility, or the MRF doesn't have the capacity to process the quantity of recycling that you are sending to them. And in order to manage this, there's a lot of different ways that you can get involved, whether it's clear signage, getting volunteers in place to engage people as they're disposing of these wastes. That's another way to engage your attendees on waste disposal and proper practice. But even if it's just simple direct signage that is telling people what goes where. So say, instead of just saying this is recycling, below your recycling label, have 4 small icons of the 4 items that can be. Or say you're one of those few markets that for some reason you can't do plastic number 2. Put a plastic water bottle with a check mark next to it and put a milk jug with a line through it, and just make it very visual and obvious to people, so that before it even gets to your hands at a sorting facility, everybody else involved has the capacity and the ability to support your program. Naturally, again, it feeds into the same conversation earlier of education. You can't just set up these stations and expect people to do it correctly. So the education in the signing, whether that's visuals, whether it's interactive displays demonstrating what you're doing throughout the event, your ultimate goal is to engage attendees and create behavioral change. For me, a big thing in this is you might have somebody going up and struggling with somebody that's telling them to recycle correctly, because they think what they want to think and they have their own beliefs behind it. But at the end of the day, if we're always there and it's the constant buzz in their ear that's saying to do the right thing, it's only a matter of time before it is done. And creating that behavioral change within our event space can be hugely impactful on the success of your programs. Because if people think of, oh, we are the Boston Marathon. The Boston Marathon has a green sustainability program, and every time we go to that marathon, there's hundreds of signs around how sustainable and eco-friendly we are. I can promise you that information and that behavior is going to trickle into these people's personal lives. And then when they're engaging at your event the next time they come out, they will remember that, and they will support your program without you really not having to support it, but without necessarily making the ask. And that's a beautiful thing to see an event transition from really, really needing a sustainability program and sorting program to getting to the point to where that program can kind of pull back and just celebrate the fact that the ecosystem within the event space has already made it there, and they are supporting themselves within it, and it is a self-sufficient, sustainable event. And then lastly, there's obviously the real-time monitoring. I mean, waste sorting is dynamic. Issues can arise. You've got to understand all the dumpsters that are on site. You've got to engage the hauler and make sure that you're calling dumpsters off at the right time. A big issue in this space is I'm done with my waste sorting shift at 6 p.m. and there are going to be vendors on site until 1 a.m. continuing to tear down my event. I don't have eyes on that dumpster from 8 p.m. to 1 a.m. and I know that those people are going to be contaminating my dumpsters. So acknowledging that ahead of time and making sure that communication and that signage is in place, or maybe you work with your hauler and you say, listen, I leave at 8 p.m. Is there any way on this Saturday we can have a one-off pickup at 8 p.m. for you guys to come out and pick up all of our for sure clean sorted loads before they go into the hands of the potential general public or the people that are just trying to tear down your event and get on to the next thing. And so with that said, I think it kind of feeds into an approach to how you would actually start a program. And so these are short and sweet, but I'm sure I could talk about them for much longer than I'm going to. But when it comes to starting, you need to set clear objectives. You need to understand where do we want to get and how are we going to get there. But again, being realistic with yourself. Don't go from we've never pulled a waste hauler ticket. We have no clue what our waste is to we're going to try and do 70%. That seems relatively achievable. Just be realistic with yourself. I like to tell people if you're starting from scratch, I mean, if right now you're sending everything to the landfill, shoot for 20%. And if you can achieve 20%, awesome. Let's scale it to 40 next year, 50. Like I said, a lot of times when you put the programs in place, like having a conversation with your waste hauler so that they know you're on site sorting, making sure that you speak with the processing facility so that they know also that the hauler is going to be bringing you sorted dumpsters and that they are going to be labeled X, Y, and Z. So for them to keep an eye out for it. You'd be surprised how I shouldn't say how many times because it doesn't happen crazy often, but it definitely happens multiple times a year. You'll have a program in place and you'll have felt like you had all of the relevant conversations. You've got everybody's contact. And then Saturday morning, the driver for your hauling company got sick. And so they had to bring a different driver out. And he has not been involved in any of these conversations. And he goes and he picks up 5 of your recycling dumpsters. And because he was on autopilot, because he didn't want to work on Saturday, he took them all to the landfill. And then you find out, hindsight, that the communication didn't make it to him. And that now all of a sudden, instead of having a 75, 80% diversion rate, you've got to report 43. And it just showcases kind of the nuance, how nuanced these conversations can be and how no matter how much control you think you have, and I'm sure there's people on this call that have instances like that where you just feel like you've dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's, and then somehow, some way, something that feels like it's out of your control impacts your diversion. And so again, just acknowledge that and be realistic with yourself and make it set an achievable goal so that you can get some momentum behind it within your event space and within your vendors. So it's something that everyone can get excited about. It's something that everybody can celebrate. And instead of every year you're asking your power vendor for their travel data because you have to calculate their emission impact for your event, and it takes 8 weeks because they just don't want to give you the time of day. You finally get to an ecosystem within your event where they're getting it to you before you're even having to ask, because they know it's an expectation. It is a pillar within your event and your practices, and it is something that you are not going to let slide. You have to kind of stand your ground and make sure that it is known that we are here to be sustainable. Yes, this is going to be difficult. Yes, this means a lot of people are probably going to have to change the way that they do operations, but this is a part of the new ecosystem and mission within this event. And if you're not, and if you don't jive with it, then maybe let's have a conversation around that. And I promise you that we can engage people that do jive with it and that will support this program. And I think you'd be surprised at how many stakeholders and vendors are willing to go beyond what they normally would to engage around sustainability once they realize that you care and that you really want to have or have it make an impact on your event. Next, choosing the right partners. I think that song has sung throughout this whole conversation. But if you're in a major city and your hauler says we don't have commercial recycling, we can't accept plastics number 2 or 5, reach out to a different hauler. They're at this point within the US for the most part, especially globally, haulers in medium-sized and even small-sized towns. I mean, there are commercial MRFs somewhere. There is somebody, I promise, that there is somebody in your space that is probably willing to take your materials. It might not be a commercial facility, and so it might be a little nuanced. We just ran an event that brought 50,000 people out to the event over the weekend, but it was in such a small town that I had to load a box truck full of bottles and cans and bags and take it to a CRV redemption facility because they don't have a commercial recycling facility. But because of all of our outreach before the event, we knew before we got there that they did not have a commercial recycling facility. So we had a sorting team in place and a truck in place to make sure that just because there are hurdles and there are barriers, that we are doing everything within our power to overcome those and get around those to make sure that they're not impacting our event. And then lastly, like I said, start small. You don't have to try and get to 70, 80% diversion. There are plenty of events that go from 0 to 5%, and that is a huge thing to celebrate just because it's never happened. And in theory, next year you'll start at 5 and you go to 10, and maybe you go to 10 to 15 or 20. But it's a system that the hardest thing to do is get in place. And once it's in place, you start to hear the gears clicking and you start to feel how everything is working together as well as not together. And that's when you can start to really make kind of targeted and meaningful change, in my opinion, in the program to have a direct impact on the actual event as it pertains to you. So with that, I know that was a lot. I took 10 minutes longer than I wanted to, but that's just kind of the nature of who I am. This is something I'm super passionate about, and I've been doing for over 6.5 years. I've ran hundreds of sorting programs from towns that have less than 5,000 peoples to we just wrapped up an event that we got 82% diversion in Dallas, Texas. And so there's a lot of things in between, and there's a lot of nuances to it. But what I'm hoping that you guys can get from this is that you are never too small to start. And even if it is quite literally just one volunteer or person for 3 hours of your event, having eyes on the waste, that knowledge can help you make strategic decisions and smart decisions going into the next year's event. And it will ultimately grow and empower your event and your vendors to be the sustainable leader within the space or in the event that you're trying to be. So thank you guys for your time. I'm excited to open this up for questions. Hopefully you guys have some. I can't imagine. I know I didn't cover it all. So please don't hesitate to either unmute or raise a hand, and we can begin this dialogue back and forth. But thank you.